Hello and welcome. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Security 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. It is Friday, and it is time for our week in review. Each week, Offensive Security team here at Security 360 is tracking, researching, and analyzing threats, vulnerabilities, etc., with the purpose of keeping you up to date on what's relevant and important in the events that have occurred this week. So you can basically just be a little bit more prepared than you were yesterday. That's kind of our hope. You got me here, Brad, and also Spencer from the Offensive Security team.
What's up, everybody?
And yeah, so this week has been a little slower than some of the other weeks. We've got 4 interesting things to talk about. We are going to talk about a specific DFIR report that is unique in that it's kind of missing some of the key elements that we normally see, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about trends related to that. We'll also talk a little bit more about the Dogwalk 0-day and how it's being used. And kind of along that same vein, we're going to talk about Follina and an exploit in the wild and how that works. And then also some ransomware that's specifically targeting ESXi servers. Not that that's new, but it's definitely a topic that we want to talk about. So do you want to get us started, Spencer, with the first one? Yeah.
Yeah, excited for another week in review.
Heck yeah.
The DFIR report. So that's the first item on our list here. I always really enjoy reading the DFIR report. It's really good information. They have really good analysts working on these articles, and they provide a lot of actionable intelligence. They provide TTPs. They provide a lot of good information for an analyst or just somebody in the security industry who's trying to get a sense of what happens in a real intrusion, right? What are real bad actors doing when they get on a network? What are the tools that they are using? What are the techniques that they are using? So really good information. It's right from the front lines, right? So
yeah.
Really good stuff. In this particular case, it was a multi-day intrusion, and it started off by exploiting a vulnerability in Manage Engine Support Center Plus. That was the method for initial access. A web shell was dropped at that point. The threat actor was then kind of just sit and waited. They enabled wdigest on the server that they gained access to, and they just sat and waited. The article says they waited for about 7 days, at which time they were able to capture administrator credentials. They used those to move laterally. They exfiltrated sensitive company documents, both via RDP and via their web shell. And that was it. They got caught because of a honey token that they opened kind of shortly after, I guess, exploiting those documents. They opened up some of those documents, and then the canary tokens fired, and they were supposedly evicted soon after that from the environment.
Sure.
The interesting part, like you mentioned at the top of this episode, is that there was no ransomware. There was no Cobalt strike. The method of access was through their web shell, and they used RDP. They used Plink to move laterally. They enabled wdigest to steal credentials from memory, and that was it. I mean, they stole sensitive documents, and we don't know the rest of the story, right? That's kind of where this article leaves off.
Sure.
So,
yeah, a couple of things that really stood out to me on this. The first of which is that they were patient, right? I think a lot of people make the maybe false assumption that, the breach happens and then everything moves really quickly after that. These guys periodically were logging into this compromised system through the web shell and just kind of checking like, hey, who's logged in? Right? What sessions exist? But of course, they had the foresight to go ahead and enable wdigest, which means, we can dump plain text creds. And so, for me, that's kind of a first red flag, right? Like my server just had a configuration change, right? So that kind of goes back to blocking and tackling and stuff. But it is fascinating to me that they sat there and patiently waited. And then literally within, I think, a couple hours or maybe a day of admin credentials showing up in a session, they dumped them and whoosh, everything just kind of hit, Mach 10. And so it's fascinating to see the thought process, because these guys are really smart. These are not a bunch of kids right in their mom's basement. These are well-seasoned hackers who were patient and paying very close attention to what was going on. And then of course the honey token, like, look, man, 5 years ago, I used to think that honeypots and internal honeypots and stuff like that were kind of like, yeah, okay, they're a novelty. These days, I mean, you and I've been busted on internal pen tests before by honeypots, right?
Yep.
And so like I'm very rapidly becoming a massive fan of setting traps throughout your environment. So
yeah, both in documents, honey accounts, right? Sensitive accounts that look sensitive, right, or juicy targets. Services, you can stand up honeypots, like you said, with services listening on them, or they look like they're listening on them. There's a lot of really cool tech you can do with canary tokens, honey tokens now. That it's a great warning system, and it's fairly low false positive.
I agree.
In this instance, it wasn't until the threat actor exfiltrated documents that it was triggered. But in so many cases, we're on pen tests or an attacker's in an environment, they're poking around at things. They're undoubtedly going to trip on something. And that's going to be a very low false positive and a very good early warning sign.
Yeah, I agree 100%, man. It's good stuff.
Yep. The next one is something that I guess has been talked about in nauseam the last, week or so.
Yeah. And we're going to keep hearing about it too, man. It's just how it is.
We will. It has to do with the Microsoft Support Diagnostic Tool and a 2+ year-old 0-day that kind of uses the Support Diagnostic Tool ultimately, but it piggybacks off of these DIAGCAB files, these diagnostic files. And essentially, this is it was jokingly dubbed Dogwalk by some security researchers. And I think the meme thing to do now is to find a vulnerability and give it some funny name.
Right.
In the end, though, it seems like, it kind of as a sidebar, it seems like that helps the publicity in a way, right? It helps it get picked up by news media more and spread more rapidly if it's got a funny name to it. Because it's like, what is this thing that everybody's talking about? Why does it have a funny name? As opposed to CVE, whatever.
Agreed.
But this one, this Dogwalk vulnerability with these DIAGCAB files essentially allows for path traversal. And essentially what that means is this specific technique exploits these DIAGCAB files, and it allows the attacker to plant a malicious file in the user's startup folder, for example. So the next time the user reboots, that malicious executable, that malware is executed, and now I have persistence on that machine through one click or potentially 2 clicks if protected views on and like Edge or something.
Right.
So again, this is an adaptation of the Support Diagnostic Tool, which ultimately needs to be fixed. We all realize that, but kind of an adaptation on what we saw with Follina, with Word documents and RTFs and things like that.
Right. Yeah, for sure, man. And so the one, the workflow still requires a decent amount of user interaction in this case, right, to get to that point, which is hopefully going to save us a little bit. So.
Yeah, there's some interesting things from a mitigation standpoint. You can, what's interesting to me with this too is that these DIAGCAB files have mark of the web. Mark of the web is something that is supposed to protect us from some of these internet-borne, email-borne attacks.
Right.
Unfortunately, mark of the web relies on the application that is doing the work to do something about mark the web, to say, hey, this file is suspicious, it comes from the internet or whatever. Unfortunately, not every application checks mark of the web. For example, the creators of 7-Zip have said they're not going to support mark of the web at all. It's a performance thing. There's other applications that don't support mark of the web or don't check for mark of the web. And unfortunately, Microsoft Support Diagnostic Tool, is one of those that it doesn't check and warn the user. So what you can do is you can tell Windows, you can configure Windows via the registry to warn when there's a DIAGCAB file that's been opened. So that's a good idea. You can do that with other file formats as well, but kind of a relatively novel approach at putting another warning or another red flag in front of the user before
Sure.
something bad happens.
Right. So would I be remiss in saying something along the lines of, if you haven't disabled the diagnostic tool in your environment via a GPO yet, you're living on borrowed time?
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement? Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's my takeaway, is we've been talking about this thing for 2 or 3 weeks now, and the end result's always the same, right? Which is, there's a lot of work that has to be done by Microsoft to make this right. We don't even know if that's going to happen. But in the meantime, and I'm becoming more convinced every day that there's no legitimate reason to have the MSDT turned on.
Yeah.
Because I haven't heard of any problems it's created. Right.
Yeah, I think Microsoft has been hesitant to release details about deploying or restricting the diagnostic tool with GPO, because they don't want it to break troubleshooting things for users. And in some ways, they've kind of botched their guidance and advisory around this. But essentially, yeah, we'll hear in one of the next stories that attackers are using this. Right, this is a thing. They have been using this already before this, and they're going to continue using this. I guess the one saving grace, and we'll hear about this in one of the later articles, is that threat actors apparently are having trouble exploiting this to some extent. There are some examples where we've seen, like Qakbot, which is the story we'll talk about in a few minutes, trying to use the Follina diagnostic tool vulnerability, right, to gain initial access.
Right.
It's not working. And,
I can't imagine. Like I said, I mean, it's just a complex workflow by comparison to other initial access methods, many of which are still valid today. This just seems like the lesser good choice, if I can mess that up.
in spoiler alert, in the story that we'll talk about with Qakbot, is they're going back to using LNK files and DLLs, right? Tried and true LNKs and DLLs. So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Cool. So the next one, before we get to that Qakbot story, is Linux malware, and specifically ransomware. Now, the Uptick's threat research team released a good article about this, a good dissection of this, I guess, if you will, of a new ransomware gang, Black Basta, deploying ransomware to ESXi servers. Now, this, like you said, Brad, earlier, this is not something that's relatively new. There are other groups like Lockbit, Black Matter, Revil, or Revel, however you choose to name them. There are examples of other groups using this, but it's just another confirmation that this is a prime target for attackers. They do want to go after your ESXi hosts, and there's some good mitigations that you can do to protect those, but they are a target, and we have to treat those as tier 0 assets in our environments.
Yes, we should do a deep dive on that at some point, and just have a dedicated podcast talking about that, because it's that important, especially in small medium business environments, right? Because everything you have is in this environment. It's probably why they're going after it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and with the companies that haven't moved to the cloud, or have traditionally been on-prem environments, they're going to have fairly large ESXi environments or Hyper-V environments, and attackers know that, and attackers are going to go after that. And this is a case of one gang producing malware specifically for ESXi hosts. So in the Uptick's article, they mentioned that this looks to be designed specifically for ESXi hosts, as opposed to other variants of Linux or Windows or something like that.
Right. So it's not even using this as a target; it is the target. Yeah. And that's a little unique, right? I don't know that I've heard of a lot of malware gangs going specifically for ESXi. It's usually been a collateral damage, or, hey, I accidentally found that I had access to this thing, and therefore, or in some cases we see once they successfully compromise the majority of Active Directory, they'll pivot to that and try to pass those credentials to ESXi. But so question for you well, go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say that leads me to one of the mitigation thoughts is, a lot of times we'll see ESXi vSphere specifically, right? vSphere server will be connected to Active Directory, such that you can use your Active Directory account, right, to log in to vSphere. And we see that on pen tests, and that's something that, I will look for during a pen test is, are we connected to vSphere? Can I log in with this admin account that I Kerberosted?
Right. Agreed. And so that actually plays perfectly into the question I was going to ask, and that is, does this particular piece of information, this new ransomware gang, does that change our recommendations at all for how to secure ESXi in the world that we live in?
I don't think it necessarily changes it, but I think it brings to light some important things to think about, right? So one of the strategies, we might recommend is disconnect the authentication from Active Directory, right? If I'm a threat actor and I get access to the domain admin account, I shouldn't be able to log into the vSphere server and then just start encrypting everything. So actually disconnecting it from Active Directory authentication is a good idea. Have a separate account for that, for administering those services. Segmentation, always a good idea, not just for ESXi, but other critical servers in subnets of your network is a good idea.
Yeah. That's one of the things I hate the most on an internal pen test is when they've done a really good job of segmenting their network off, because it is really hard and takes a long time to effectively jump from subnet to subnet when segmentation is implemented correctly. And I mean, it's supposed to be hard, right? But to that point, that doesn't just mitigate, ESXi ransomware. That mitigates a lot of stuff, especially if you can be so fortunate as to have your critical infrastructure, very well segmented from your workstation population.
Yeah. And having, it goes back to what we said, what you've said a number of times, is the blocking and tackling, right? Keep your software up to date, segment your network, have good privileged access management controls, have good backups, right? That are offline and kind of disconnected, and you have them somewhere where ransomware can't get them or they can't be deleted. So blocking and tackling, right?
It is. And it amazes me, by the way, that back when I first started getting into security, like we're talking 20 years ago, right? Like there are people listening to this podcast that weren't alive when I started doing security. So, but the point is, we were doing offline, off-prem backups 20 years ago. So it still blows my mind that ransomware has been as successful as it has been. I don't know at what point we stopped doing the basics. But I feel like we are still 20 years later talking about the basics. Patch your stuff, monitor your stuff, isolate your stuff, back your stuff up. Just all that stuff. So anyway.
And it's not to say that it's easy or trivial, right?
Oh no, not at all.
But it does get to a point where it's a broken record at some point, because it's like we're saying the same things over and over again, and it almost feels like it's getting harder and harder to do some of these things.
It is
with new technology moving to the cloud. We don't have control over the data as much, so it is it's not a trivial thing. It's getting harder. And one thing I'll say is, a lot of people joke about physical tape backup, right? Like LTO4, LTO5, whatever we're on now. But it's like, hey, if you got that tape in your hand and you're confident you can recover from that tape, that is as good as gold.
Somebody's going to have to beat me up to take this backup copy away from me. No. And you know what? Still to this day, me personally, I do offline backups once a week. Like I plug a USB drive and then I remove it after my backup is done.
Yeah. A lot of people do.
So, I mean, it's absolutely critical.
Yeah. Cool. Well, this is the fourth and last story for this episode. And like I said, it ties into the previous discussion we had about Follina and Dogwalk. This is a story or a series of stories, I guess, kind of news that a threat actor that Proofpoint has named as TA570 has been seen pushing Qakbot. And the interesting thing, like I said earlier, is that they attempted to use the Follina exploit with the Word document, the docx, as their method of initial access. And the Sanzin article that is linked here is the researcher had trouble getting that to execute both in a lab and in online sandboxes. So like any.run had trouble getting that exploit to fire. It's unclear if it's the version of Office or the problem with the payload or something like that, but it would appear that those threat actors are getting frustrated with that not working and have since just gone back to their tried and true method, like I said, of LNKs and DLLs. So this Follina thing was big and it like created a whole lot of buzz, but I guess the good side is, detections are coming out and apparently it's hard for threat actors to exploit this fully, which is good.
Right. I agree. And I think we talked briefly about that when we first started talking about the Follina stuff, and it's, it is a boutique style of initial access. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I asked on Twitter yesterday or a couple of days ago, I asked some people, what would be the cause for this payload to not execute? Is it a problem, or this vulnerability to fully execute? Is it a problem with the payload? Maybe it's the payload size. Maybe it's the Office version. Maybe Microsoft has hardened, the latest release of Office 365. It could be any number of things. But the good news is it's not being abused as significantly as we thought, which I think is good all around.
Yeah. Yeah. This just goes back to the old properties of KISS, right? Keep it simple. And so, there's so many moving parts to successfully deliver an exploit and then do something with it that I can understand why this has been marginally successful.
Yeah. And, the good news is there's a relatively trivial fix for this. You deploy the group policy, don't allow the troubleshooting wizard to execute. And as far as we know right now, that's a fairly good workaround, right? Until there's some permanent fix. So, not to belabor the Follina Microsoft support diagnostic tool issue, but it will come back again. And it's one of those things that just reminds us that threat actors are going to try these new, relatively novel attacks, and if they don't work or for some reason they're not having success, they'll go back to their tried and true methods, whatever those might be at the time.
Agreed. And I love it's indicative of how difficult this thing is to make it work when, like you said, the analyst was having trouble getting it to fire. And when you look through the actual article, you read everything, it's like, this is a really long article to say it didn't work.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that the malware authors are wasting their time on it. Sure. I want to do that more.
Yep. I like it.
Good deal. So yeah, it's shorter than usual for us, which is awesome. So happy Friday, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. And we'll see you folks next week.
Thanks.